What do Canadians think about religion in the public square, and does it have any role at all to play? Check it out.
To say no to the question of God is as much of a faith statement as to say yes to the question of God. It's the same question. When I speak to groups of young people about getting civically involved, I always tell them, you don't have to join a political party. You can join the symphony orchestra. That is as much a political statement, because what is the public square? It is our collective understanding of the good, the true, the beautiful, and how it is that we live together.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Watley, and today we spoke with Ray Pennings, who's the co-founder and executive VP of the think tank Cardus, based in Ottawa. Ray is an author. He's written on education, law, theology, and his bio says that he's worked in politics and punditry. Today we talked about a study that's just come out. This is the first time they've actually looked at the difference between Americans and Canadians. In their press release, Cardus said that right-leaning Canadians are actually religiously closer to Harris Democrats than Trump Republicans. So quite a provocative line there for sure. Our discussion got into the data, and certainly there's big differences north and south of the border. But I think I really got Ray excited when we started talking about the question of separation of church and state. And what does that mean practically? He said, it's impossible to have no religious opinion in the public square. Either a particular religious opinion or having an opinion of no religious opinion is still an opinion, and it's still present in public life. So we got him very excited about that. Ray has spent the last 3 decades at least researching the role of religious belief, not just Christianity, but all religions, in the public square, specifically in Canada. And I couldn't come up with a question that he probably hadn't answered many times before. And so his answers are deep and nuanced. He's an articulate defender of an authenticity that we should bring to the public square. We closed our conversation with something that I think is crucial. He said that up to 1/3 of the charitable giving and volunteer work, at least 30% of the people doing that work have some sort of religious affiliation, and generally they're from the Christian community. Now, I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. On with the show. Ray Pennings, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sean.
I was excited to see the press release for a new study you've put out. It's actually building on an annual work that you guys do at Cardus. But I want to read this line because I thought this was a good way to smack people, to poke the bear. That's a nice way to say it. You say this, quote, right-leaning Canadians are actually religiously closer to Harris Democrats than Trump Republicans, end quote. Explain.
Well, there's a couple of things. This is the data we're going to talk about is based on a survey of 5,000 Canadians and 5,000 Americans. So a 10,000 person survey is pretty rare. It's also fairly expensive, which is why it's rare. We have been measuring in Canada since 2017 in partnership with the Angus Reid Institute, something we call the spectrum of spirituality. And my concern was, and this started as a sesquicentennial project for Canada. We were 150. My private beef has always been that when people talk about, we're becoming more secular and all the rest, they just use self-identification, Stats Canada data, or religious attendance as the proxies. And somehow that measures everything about religion. And our conviction was that isn't really an accurate measure. So what we did is we started surveying people, asking them about 7 behaviors. Do you believe in God? Do you believe in an afterlife? Have you had a religious experience? Do you believe in life after? Do you educate your children according to religious code? Do you go to church? Do you pray? Do you read a sacred text? If you do 6 or 7 of those things, we call you religiously committed. So when I talk about religiously committed in here, I'm talking about people who are doing at least 6 of those things, regardless of religion. So this counts in Jews, Muslims, these are samples of the whole population. So what is interesting is we've known for some time that religiosity in the United States is almost double of what it is in Canada, on almost every metric. So twice as many people go to church, twice as many pray, right across the board. What is interesting is I always had the suspicion there is a different character of, forget the number, the nature of religion as it is practiced is quite different on both sets of the borders. Now, I'm talking from a broad statistical point of view. You will find, Trump supporters and everything who fit totally in Texas, who live in Ontario and not just Alberta. But when you actually take the sum and total of religiosity in Canada and the particular implications that has for politics, what it has for obviously religious communities, frankly, what it has for charities, care for the poor, disproportionately falls still on the charitable sector in Canada. So there are huge differences, and what we wanted to discover, which is why for the first time we applied this methodology to a U.S. audience, and we did a concurrent Canadian one, so we had valid comparisons. So that by means of background for everything we're going to say. Let me get right to your question, because it is interesting. In the U.S., there is a politicization of religion, particularly evangelical religion, but it applies to others, that has almost 80% of them in the Trump camp, with a whole bunch of, forget who they vote for, there's a whole bunch of other characteristics that come with that. Frankly, that's not true in Canada. When you actually take a look at the religiously committed people, they're slightly more voting conservative than others, but frankly, conservative, liberal, New Democrat, Bloc Québécois, they actually represent, with some exaggerations here and there, but they vote right across the spectrum in much less homogeneous ways than the United States. And that speaks to a much bigger difference in terms of how people understand faith and public life on either side of the 49th.
Yeah. Great. Well said. So, I promised you we'd jump into the data, but of course your comments raise a few questions right away. And so
Go for it.
You mentioned the politicization of religion. And I heard someone make a comment recently that they were pushing back on that. They said, hey, wait a second. We haven't politicized religion. The politicians have brought theology into politics. And so when the state starts to define what is a person, when the state starts to define what is the moment at which life starts, so, and whether or not a man is a man and a woman is a woman. So they've gone way into theology. So I'm giving a gentle pushback. Do you think actually it's not so much about politicizing religion, but rather bringing religion into politics without calling it religion? What are your thoughts on that?
So let me answer that two ways. First, historically, and then just with some present. So if we actually take a look at history, you can't separate out a sense of the common good and religious or transcendent beliefs. So there is a sense in which we are all religious. We have a spectrum of spirituality, and there is a sign of those who are non-religious. But that doesn't mean they have any less defined views about any of the controversial questions that you raise. So if the political question, if any of these are political questions, it's as political or religious to say yes to the question as it is to say no. So nobody's introducing. These questions are inherently part of our public life. There again, we have a very different history on both sides of the border. U.S. Manifest Destiny, The City on the Hill, all the stories that are told. The story America tells itself, about itself, its own self-identity, is very much of a certain mission of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as they articulate in their Constitution. What's interesting, if you actually take a look at the history of Canada, let's go back to 1763 and the Quebec Act. What was the motivation right there? Well, there was a certain American expansionism happening, and these people didn't want to be Americans. And so the French Catholics and the English Protestants and the Battle of the Plains of Abraham happened, but they decided to get along. And so they introduced the Quebec Act, which actually protected French Catholicism. Even though the English had won the war, they provided space for Catholic practice. And that wasn't just the right to go to church or freedom of religion. That was a particular way of life that was understood. Fast forward to the 1860s. The American Civil War is happening. U.S. expansionism is happening. And there are, 1812 had happened and a whole bunch of other things. And what was the impulse for the Charlottetown Conference in 1863? Why did that happen in 1863 and not a decade earlier or a decade later? Well, the American Civil War was going on. And there were concerns about whether or not Canadians were going to be drawn in. And while they didn't agree on a whole pile of stuff, a whole pile of United Empire loyalists had come after the U.S. They were loyal to the British Crown. In many ways, the American experiment was much more of a Protestant, Max Weber, spirit of capitalism, all of that stuff. In Canada, what did we do? Well, we struck a peace treaty between French Catholics and English Protestants. And look at the Constitution. Peace, order, and good government. Living with difference. Sections 92 and 93 of the Constitution. We're education pluralism, so that the Catholics can have Catholic education even if they live in other parts of the country, and the Protestants can have Protestant education even if it's embedded right into the Constitution. So to pretend that these things are not part of religion or they're being introduced one way or the other, inherently a nation has a sense of a common good, a sense of identity, and I would argue all of us are believers of one sort or another. To say no to the question of God is as much of a faith statement as to say yes to the question of God. It's the same question. So I would push back to the person who pushed back to you and say inherently, questions of how we live together depends on a view of the human person, what we understand a human person to be, what dignity is, what respects is, what rights are, what justice are, and how we should live together. Those are inherently religious questions that are impacted by religion and your religious views. Yeah. So, which brings to the second question. It's interesting, the list of issues you highlighted, the life, the gender, the sexuality, the content, the hot button issues as we talk to them. And to be sure, religious people have views on those that are countercultural. What's interesting, and this is right across the world, not just in Canada and the United States, but let's just keep it local for a moment. It's interesting. Where did hospitals come from? Who organized the first hospitals? Who organized the first schools, the first universities? Who, to this day, takes care of the poor disproportionately, both here and in terms of foreign aid? And this isn't one religion. I can talk about the Mennonite Central Committee. I can talk about Jewish adoption agencies. Drive down Toronto, University Avenues, Mount Zion Hospital, all go St. Joseph's, I'm sitting here in Hamilton right now, a couple blocks from St. Joseph's Hospital, Vancouver, the largest hospital, St. Paul's. Where do they all come from? Yeah. So they are it's not just part of our politics, it's part of how we live together. And it remains to this day. We won't talk about it very easily.
Yeah. Brilliant. So many things we could jump off of, but I want to pivot around back. I've made a bunch of notes. If you ever see me looking down, it's because I'm writing furiously when you make a comment. But one thing that I thought we could hook on to get back to your study, you talked about manifest destiny. And at the same time, you mentioned that the Canadian approach to the Catholics and Protestants was to protect a way of life. Catholicism was a whole way of life. And so it almost seems like historically we were fairly bullish on religion and faith being part of our social life. And yet now we get to your most recent data, a very large study. It's kudos to you too. When I saw 5,000 on each side of the border, I thought, wow, this is not a small study. And one of the findings was that the percentage of Canadian versus Americans who are public about their faith and whether or not they want public figures to speak about faith. Now, I don't have those numbers memorized. I could click over to the study itself, but
it's
wonder if you could pick it up
U.S. is about 70 and Canadians is just over half in terms of being public about faith.
Right. So why, given what what we said about wanting to protect a way of life, why does it seem, according to these results, that Canadians have kind of pulled away from that and Americans seem very bullish on religion in public life? What are your thoughts on that? Why is there a difference?
So there are a couple of things. So first of all, what the study shows very interestingly is that American religiously committed. So let's now just talk about, the 36% or so in the U.S. and roughly half that amount in Canada, who are religiously committed. So they're not just checking the box. They're praying, they're educating their kids, they're going to church or synagogue or mosque. It should be noted that even in Canada, still about 90% of religiosity is Christian. So, on a given Sunday, if we just take weekly religious attendance, in Canada, the number is about 6% of Canadians go weekly to a Catholic Mass, about 5% go to a Protestant, and about 2% is everybody else combined. So mosques, synagogues, gurdwaras make up between 1.5% and 2% of weekly church attendance. Now, you can play with the numbers all sorts of ways. Go to monthly, and you get slightly different patterns. And obviously, I also just need to acknowledge that a study of this nature, Hindu and Buddhist, for example, don't have the same practices and rhythms of weekly worship that would others. So you ask questions, inherently there are biases in the questions along the way. The reality is the vast majority, even Stats Canada data still say that the majority of Christians Canadians identify as Christian. The second largest is non-religious. And frankly, everybody else combined is only about 12% of the population. And I say only not to denigrate, just to give a sense of proportion. So we are talking predominantly about Christian practice when we discuss this. What's interesting is that we ask a whole battery of questions. I won't bore your audience with all the detailed numbers, but essentially Americans have much more faith in their political process as reinforcing their faith convictions. So religiously committed Americans are more likely to say their vote has agency. We ask questions, does it make a difference? Does your vote even make a difference? And those sorts of things. Take all the questions about politics together. Americans are much more robust that their civic institutions reinforce their faith. Canadians, on the other hand, live in a sense of hostility. It wasn't on this survey, but in Canada, I've done over 20 surveys now with Angus Reid since 2017. And one of the questions we ask every few years, and I wrote this in a policy options article right after, I think, the 2019 election, where Andrew Scheer was sort of, castigated for his faith in public life. So we asked a bunch of questions on a survey right after. It was a very interesting question. I said, do you believe the following groups are a net benefit or damaging to society? And we had 8 religions. And I went Catholic, Protestant, evangelical, Hindu, Jew, Muslim, atheist. So 8 on that side. And we asked every person about 4 of them. So we just rotated randomly so it didn't become too tedious. The irony is you are by definition asking people about religion other than their own. If I'm a Jew, I'm being asked, do you think the Muslims a net benefit or a damage to society? And we've done this, I think, 4 or 5 times now since 2017. Consistently on every survey, the more religious you are, the more respectful you are of everyone else who is religious.
Oh, wow.
And the less religious you are, we have 4 measures of religiosity. If you take the non-religious group, which is about 23% in Canada, they are negative on every other group than themselves. So they are saying that every group except the non-religious are damaging to society. They're the only ones who are doing any good, social good. Now, I'm saying it polemically here, but what's interesting, this isn't one survey, this is multiple surveys. And what we find in the survey we've just done in Canada and the US in terms of agency, hostility, being public, we didn't ask the question quite the same way, but 4 or 5 questions get at some of the same stuff. You are finding that religious people, especially in Canada, feel the culture is very hostile to them. And what's interesting is even in terms of hope for the country and satisfaction, religious Canadians are less hopeful and less satisfied in Canada than the general population. In the U.S., it's the opposite. In the U.S., the more religiously committed you are, the more hopeful you are about the country. So in the U.S., if you're religious, you find the culture reinforcing and a hospitable place for you to live. Mm-hmm. And in Canada, it doesn't matter what religion you are. Obviously, it's slightly different. But, being Jewish, especially today, being evangelical or being Muslim, those are the 3 that are the most negative. Our culture isn't particularly hospitable to people who are public about that. And when you know that being public about your faith is going to result in hostility, it's somewhat natural that you're not going to be as forward about it.
Right. So in your studies, have you come across why that is? I've heard some people say, well, the Americans have more of a free market approach to religiosity. So everybody's competing and you have multiple different denominations and they're all fighting to market themselves as offering something better. Whereas in Canada, we kind of have almost a pseudo institutionalized approach. Our head of state is head of the Anglican Church. And so I'm sure you've turned your mind to that. You mentioned hope. I think that's legitimate. You mentioned trust in civic institutions. I'd love to push back on that, but we'll just leave that as a given. We'll say, yes, that's true. But why does that, have we answered why there's so much less religiosity, besides the fact that it's today less attractive to be open about faith in the Canadian context? How did we get here? Maybe that's the right question. How did we get here?
And I certainly have opinion. I just want to qualify, there's a difference between data, what data can tell you, and interpreting the data. And your question here is about the interpretation of the data. So I fully recognize that there are other people who might take the same set of data and try to argue different things because we bring other factors than data into our interpretation of data, whether that's history, culture, perspective along the way. So a couple of things. First of all, there is, in spite of, the French component in Canada and many other languages and the Spanish component, especially in the United States, English remains the lingua franca of North America, especially when it comes to religion. Most religious bodies have relationships across the border with other churches, theology and all that. So I think to some extent it's more legitimate to talk about North American when it comes to religion. Many people belong to denominations that are on both sides of the border reading the same thing. So those influences don't necessarily respect the 49th parallel. Interestingly, while there are some establishment churches in Canada, those are the churches that probably are more on the decline. Mainstream Protestantism in Canada is declining, whereas the attendance at church, the attendance at churches, frankly, where it's increasing these days, and one of the things we can talk about a little bit is there are demographic elements to this. Ironically, the least religious are Gen Xers and baby boomers. This coming week, I already mentioned, 12% of Canadians will go to church. 18% of those under the age of 34 will. So, the religiosity is in the 55 or 65 plus, which has a particular characteristic of, much more historic. And probably that's where, go to any Presbyterian, Anglican, United Church, Presbyterian Church of Canada, those mainstream historic denominations, and there's probably an older demographic that you're most likely to find in those churches today. Go to an evangelical church, and then particularly an evangelical church in an ethnic community. Some of the largest church, 28% of those born outside of the country and first generation are attending church regularly. So, What's interesting is the younger demographic and the immigrant demographic is where the most vibrant religion and religious expression in Canada is happening, which, if I were a cultural predictor or a political person with a longer-term point of view, I would be very cognizant of that and say, guess which populations are going to be voting next year and or 10 years from now, and which ones are going to be falling off a decade from now. Let's just take a look at these trends as they go into the future. When a quarter of people in Canada are born outside of the country, that has significant implications. And ironically, the religion of the future is not your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Interesting. So that ties in again back to the study in question that we started out with. One of the questions that you ask is party affiliation, and you alluded to that a little bit earlier. You said it's spread across all the parties. But then if we start talking about the rise in this new demographic that you just mentioned, can you make any predictions? Again, we're predicting now, we're interpreting, we're not just discussing the hard data outcomes. We're trying to anticipate the future. What are your thoughts then on this rising demographic in the young and party affiliation?
I think, parties, as we're seeing in real time right now, change very much. If I was a progressive in favor of the environment and the carbon tax and everything else, up until 2 years ago, I was a liberal and they were my champions, and they're not so much today in the same sort of way. And that happens on all sides of the political spectrum, depending on who the leader is. So if we take broad-based conservatism versus progressivism in terms of just rough political ideologies on either side of the spectrum, and those labels deserve much more nuance, but for the purposes of conversation, let's just use those as two sides of the spectrum along the way. What is interesting is that when it comes to historically, immigration, there's been an immigration consensus, frankly, historically in Canada on all sides, in which we recognized we had a very large landmass. Economically, we needed to fill in people. When I was born, there were 9 million Canadians, and that was about a century. When Canada was founded, there were about 3 million. Over the first century, when we went 9 million, I'm now in my late 50s, and that has quadrupled in 50 years. So it tripled in 100 years, it quadrupled. So even at the same pace along the way, we're going to go from tripling to 8 to 10 times in the second century of Canada. That has huge implications. Where do these people come from? Right now, they're coming, from right across the world in terms of diverse religious backgrounds. Ironically, they're much more, from a values point of view in terms of understanding family. Now, they understand family different. When you and I say family, with, both of our white Anglo-Saxon cultural background, we think dad, mom, and kids. When someone who is in the Eastern Hemisphere, born and raised in the Eastern Hemisphere, they think of all the uncles and aunts and grandparents and multi-generational homes. And there are just given expectations, even economically, in terms of how, in some cultures, when you get married, the parents of the groom buy the house, the parents of the bride buy the furniture, they set you up. That's a part of the obligation. However, the minute they're 60 or whatever, guess what? You're on the hook to take care of them for the rest of their lives. And, we're living closer to 90 these days than 75 for a lot of people. So this isn't just about religion. This is about responsibility. This is about obligation. This is about social organization. I think we are at a tipping point in which the past assumptions that if you were an immigrant to Canada, you were more likely to vote for the Liberal Party because it was the party of immigration and all the rest. I think some of that is changing, and I think we've seen it change significantly in the last decade. And I think it's up for grabs in terms of where that's heading into the future. But keep in mind that probably the most socially conservative values, last year when there was the 1 million-person march on some of the sexual education curriculum in Ontario, it was led by Muslims. not evangelical Christians.
Mm. Mm.
And many of those, some of them were obvious. There's a range, obviously, in terms of how that expresses itself. But the old categories, and I think that's what this data really tells us, the old categories don't necessarily hold.
Mm.
There's a very different way within the country religious expresses itself between ethnic communities in regions. We're talking as if all of Canada is the same. Well, no, it's not. Steinbeck, Manitoba, and Abbotsford, British Columbia are fairly different than downtown Toronto, which again is very different than, frankly, Indigenous communities, which it's not often said, but frankly, about 70% of Indigenous identify themselves as Christian.
Wow. Didn't know that. Wow. So you made some great comments about family too. It reminded me of a comment, I believe it was one of my family members, I think it was my daughter, who was traveling. She was in New Zealand, and they were going to school with some folks from the Eastern Hemisphere. And they felt it was normal to have been raised by their grandparents.
Yeah.
They said, well, of course, because mom and dad both have full-time jobs. There's no way they could possibly raise us. We have grandma and grandpa at home in the house raising us. That's normal. That's how people live. And yet, to your point, that's not a normal assumption when we talk about family. So it seems like we're in the midst of changing ideas about family, about culture. It reminded me also of a comment that Ron Dart mentioned to me the other day. We were talking about the common good. So you mentioned the common good. Right away you think, oh, is he talking about Toryism? I don't think you're talking about Toryism, but Ron said that, well, Toryism is this grand thing that encompasses everything, and it's really just fractured. So we have the Green Party picking up parts of it and the Liberal Party picking up parts of it. I'm not saying I agree with his comments. I'm just saying that's how he pictured the whole thing. So your response about party affiliation and how parties change over time, especially in Canada, they're so tied to the ideas of a particular leader that it's almost too risky for us even to ask a question about party affiliation. You were very gracious, but really maybe it was a dumb question in the first place.
Faith in public life, as somebody who talks publicly about this on pretty regularly from a wide range of interviewers, the assumption is always that it's the religious right, and there's no doubt the data shows probably it's a little more conservative on a number of these things. But, even with Trump, arguably, Trump is the guy who took the pro-life components out of the Republican platform. He's not necessarily, we don't look to President Trump necessarily for coherent political philosophy and aligning everything that is there. So yes, he appointed a couple of judges that the pro-life community widely applauds, but arguably some of the decision by removing Roe versus Wade from a federal level to a state level, there are some cases in which the rates of abortion are actually going to increase as opposed to decrease as a result of that. The irony is, in Canada, and it's true in the States as well, but in Canada, the most storied part of religious involvement in Canada actually comes from the left, the social gospel movement. The Winnipeg General Strike, 1917, out of that you had sort of the four wise men, Woodward and Bland and all the rest, and led to Tommy Douglas in Saskatchewan and Medicare and Care for the Pure and the cooperative movement that still is part of prairie social gospel populism that influences his politics to this day. And an NDP government in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, ironically, over the last couple of decades have been fiscally more conservative than many governments that had conservative in their label, but had a particular ethos that was religiously inspired. The NDP in 1961 really was a cooperation between three groups. You had trade unionists, you had social gospel, and you sort of had the academic left. What is interesting, I had the opportunity, I happened to be sitting beside a former federal NDP secretary on an air flight last year, and we got into this discussion, and I said, just help me in terms of the NDP. And she basically conceded to me and said that social gospel movement is not a vibrant part of the federal NDP. But then she quickly went to say, but we're one party and we're provincial wings, and then quickly highlighted, where it was probably Bill Blakey running for the NDP leadership is the last, but that's not that long ago. That's 15 years ago or so, was the last signature piece of that. And there are still elements to be found in it. And the NDP is looking for renewal and all the rest. I'm curious to see if any of those roots will come back up in terms of its current processes.
Yeah. So you mentioned Tommy Douglas, and I don't want to talk about healthcare because that's a rabbit trail. but when you put that shiny object in front of my squirrel brain, I have to jump at it. So one of the things I say whenever someone mentions Tommy Douglas is, first, I disagree with him on almost everything. I do agree with his, some of his Baptist theology and things. But the one thing I always come to Tommy Douglas's defense on is the fact that his party tabled, I've been saying 15 balanced budgets, but I think it actually might be 17 balanced budgets when he was in office. Basically, that was the norm. You do not put forward a budget with a deficit. You do not go into debt. So to your point about the social gospel prairie's approach to things, that was a very different approach on fiscal issues, community economics than what we see in the modern NDP version of it. But this leads to my question that I've been dying to ask you. So one of this question might speak to the type of Christians I hang around with and the churches I go to, but it seems to me that a lot of people who self-identify as Christians in Canada are more on the left end of the spectrum on many issues. And so Roger Scruton, one of my heroes, he said, well, no, I don't want to have, we can have an institutional church, but we definitely don't want to bring Christianity or religion into politics because the church is so susceptible to becoming liberalized, liberal theology, process theology, all the rest. And certainly in my limited experience, that's some of the observations I make. It seems like a lot of people with religious, intentional or explicit religious affiliation are often falling left of center. And sometimes it's my hardcore atheist, anarcho-capitalists who are the farthest on the right of the spectrum, emphasizing freedom, individuality, free markets. And I'm pulling away from that trend, by the way. I'm finding that it doesn't have answers to some of the social problems we face. So it's a long-winded way to get your thoughts on this separation of church and state. You've very much you've raised the salience, or highlighted the salience is a better way to put it. You've highlighted the salience of religiosity in the public square. And yet, I wonder, is there a risk in that? Are we playing with dynamite? Because religiosity might mean a very hardcore left liberal swing to the public space. So how do you work that out, the church-state separation and some of the risks of bringing religiosity into the public square?
Yeah. So as I said in my earlier answer, I think religiosity is there because we're all religious. Everybody is religious. To say no to a question is as much a religious statement, a statement of faith, as to say yes. And I frankly think that those who say they don't believe in any transcendent have more faith because I don't know how they can explain a whole bunch of things without any transcendent realities. And what strikes me is they say there are no absolutes, and they're always absolutely sure of that. So we all bring our own perspectives to it. I don't like political labels, but if you had to put one on me, I'm a Burkean conservative. Tocqueville, strong emphasis on civil society, emphasis. A couple of things come out of that, and that's informed by my own religious perspective. And I wrote a thesis on church-state religion sort of stuff. But let's skip all the details in that. I think, number one, I believe in limited government. I believe in the integrity of the various spheres. So government has its task. The church has its task, but I'm not a classical liberal in which there are just the individual and government and everything else is the result of choice. I actually believe family has its task, business has its the community. There are different institutions of society, and they all comprise the public square. So when I speak to groups of young people about getting civically involved, I always tell them, you don't have to join a political party. You can join the symphony orchestra. That is as much a political statement, because what is the public square? It is our collective understanding of the good, the true, the beautiful, and how it is that we live together. And we are inherent that we can't escape it. We're all social people. We live alongside others, and we have to negotiate the terms by which the public square will incorporate that for the public good. And defining any one of those words requires some assumptions in that betrays religious beliefs, fundamental core beliefs of one sort or another. So I believe in the public. I'm also a principled pluralist. I highlight that to say number one, I'm not a relativist. Pluralism is not relativism. This is not a John Rawls process. The government is only the referee. It doesn't stand for anything. So I believe in religious freedom, but I don't believe in religious freedom for Aztecs. Why? Because they will go beyond, their belief in terms of the legitimacy of killing other people and disrespecting their rights goes beyond the nature of what freedom. It's no longer religious freedom because their religious freedom comes at the expense of someone else's. So when I say a principled pluralism that grants, let's just say religious freedom, for instance, that's much more than a private right to worship. Because religion, by its very nature, has public expression. It has care for the poor. It has that. And I believe that in our society, we create maximum room and maximum freedom for different groups. So the Jews should be able to freely gather in their synagogues as the Muslims do in their mosques, as the Christians do in their churches. And the role of the state is, for justice, is to ensure that they all have equal freedom, protection, security. Now, what they say inside of that is within the sphere of the church. I've been involved in church government and canon law and all of the other things as it applies within my own denomination. The church order of the church I belong to says in ecclesiastical assemblies, only ecclesiastical matters shall be discussed, and that in an ecclesiastical manner. What does that mean? Well, first of all, there is a boundary to the church in terms of what it can say. The church can preach in terms of biblical principles about family, about morals, about husbands loving their wives and wives loving their husbands, and parents educating their children in the Lord, and all the biblical precepts. But the church can't go and say, oh, by the way, that translates into the fact that every family in this church will have a curfew at 10 o'clock at night for their kids, and that's the biblical way. No, that's going beyond. Then the church is stepping into the sphere of the family. So ecclesiastical matters, interpreting the scripture for all of life, which includes public life, in an ecclesiastical manner. In a democracy, we get our legitimacy through a majority vote, and once the motion passed, we all agree to live with it. Ecclesiastical manners, and I'm a Reformed Presbyterian, so we believe in church government, the priesthood of all believers, there's participation and voting. It looks like a regular political, we move motions, second motions, carry motions, but we aim not to pass motions, we aim for a consensus. That's different than the politics where we just pass motions and focus on the majority. So there's a very different orientation. Why? Because it's a different sphere. So that's just an illustration of voting. I'll use another illustration in terms of black ink on the bottom line. Every organization needs to take in more money than it spends, or else it's in trouble. Now, a business that doesn't make a fair profit is not a good business, because the point of business is stewardship and return on investment and pay. A church also needs black ink, but a church that has a huge bank account, I would argue, is a bad church. Because what it's doing is it's hoarding those resources that ought to be used for ministry. It ought to be used for care for the poor. It ought to be used for the spreading of the gospel. A family similar, let's just go to an art gallery. An art gallery, the objective is black ink, but it's not a huge bank account. It's beautiful art. and it's participation. So spend the money on the thing. So every institution has its own norm. And together they make up public life. So when I'm in politics, I deal with political matters. I can't separate from the fundamental core principles, whether I'm in politics, the arts. Religion has something to say about what's good art and what's bad art. Religion has something to say in terms of core principles. God is a God of beauty, and that beauty is reflected. And so as I understand God is beauty and God is goodness, I can't help but have those understandings, those fundamental understandings of who God is and then who I am. My last example, just to highlight the difference, I always say that the core political belief of a Christian, and speaking for myself here, is that human beings are created in the image bearers of God. That means I'm a Christian. I believe in the triune God. God is a social being, three persons in communion with each other. We are social beings. We live not to be isolated. We cannot live our lives without communion with other people. We are image bearers of a God who is a communal being. We also have dignity and worth. Now, if I go to an art gallery and see a Sean Watley painting on the wall, and I look at that painting and take it down and stomp on it and everything else, I haven't just destroyed the painting. I've insulted Sean Watley, the creator. One of the challenges I have, especially when I'm talking to younger people, is saying if you want to be a Christian in politics, the most fundamental starting point is how you treat other people. And so I say, think of the political person you hate the most, you disagree with the most. Start with reminding yourself that person's an image bearer of God. I need to treat him or her with the respect that an image bearer of God deserves. Frankly, the indicatives always precede the imperatives for people of faith in public life. It is who we are that shapes what we do. And much of the concern about the mixing of church and state, in my view, comes from two fundamental problems that I put a lot of the blame on communities of faith. But as I said, I view everybody one way or the other as coming from a faith. Atheists have their faith as well. But number one is we've not respected the boundaries of the different institutions, and we have just made everything state business, and it's not. I believe in limited government. It needs to keep its nose out of those other spheres, just as those other spheres need to keep their nose out of government. But secondly, ultimately, faith is about who I am as an individual and who I understand myself to be as an individual. And if I am an image bearer of God, and you are an image bearer of God, I cannot proceed if I disrespect you as that image bearer, I fundamentally have violated my own faith. And that's the starting point for Christian engagement, faithful engagement in public square.
Wow. So that should have been my first question, because it just seemed like we put a stick of dynamite inside Ray Pennings, and that was beautiful. So as you're scribbling notes, I'm running out of space on my page, and the thought jumped to mind. You said you started your response by saying it's impossible even to pretend that our spirituality, faith, religiosity is...
Or lack thereof,
exactly, is absent from the public square. So you say, and I agree with you, given that, does your survey response make sense when people say, oh, no, I believe we should keep our religiosity private and out of the public square? So you've said, on the one hand, it's impossible, and yet we have almost 50%. I could dig out the exact numbers, but a huge proportion say they either strongly disagree or they moderately disagree with displaying any of their religiosity, spirituality, or lack thereof. Mind you, I would argue the people with the lack thereof are very open about their lack thereof. But so there's a cognitive dissonance there. You're saying it's a fact, and yet the public seems to say, no, we think we should keep that fact hidden. How do you make sense of that?
So contextually, you and I have the luxury of an hour-long podcast in which we can philosophically deal with these things and nuance them. A survey has 15 minutes of someone online, and you can't get into these nuanced sort of understandings. So when people talk about, the question is, I'm public about my religion and faith and don't mind other people knowing I'm a believer. What does it mean to be public in faith and don't mind other people brings to mind in the Canadian setting, for example, that if I'm public about the fact that, I am a born-again Christian, there are a lot of people who are going to immediately, whether they tell me or not, think that means I have to be a bigot. And they're going to treat me like one. Well, you know what? I'm not shy about my faith. I've made a career of being very public about my faith and talking and writing about these things, so I can't escape it. And I've been called worse than a bigot, but I do get called that stuff on a pretty regular basis. It is not easy to be public about your faith in Canada today. Mm-hmm. And what I'm facing is pretty moderate compared to what Jewish people are facing today. Mm-hmm. So let's just understand the context in which the question lands. And I fully understand that when I'm filling out a survey and I see being public, I don't mind being public about it. If I was a Jewish parent who just heard this after their kid got told whatever they got told at school today, I can understand the response. So I don't take these responses as representing philosophic point of view. I take these responses as surveys do in terms of lived reality along the way. However, I will also challenge, and it's one of the reasons Cardus exists and has existed for 25 years, I would challenge the fact that to pretend that we should not talk about these things, that therefore, because we're not public about it, we should just normalize that and say, no, this is just your private belief. And, whether Sean Watley is a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim is about as significant to me as his neighbor as to whether or not he likes his steak rare, medium rare, or well done. And it's just a matter of his personal choice. No, your religion has public consequences. Your beliefs about these things do influence the way you vote, do influence your sense of responsibility, your understanding of justice, your notion of the common good. And it strikes me that if we want a healthy democratic society that lives up to the things we aspire to and we say our democracies are all about, then we should do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to live in a Muslim authoritarian state, but frankly, secular authoritarianism isn't all that much more tolerant.
Yeah. Wow. You've given a lot of thought to these answers, and I get the sense these aren't the first time you've answered some of these questions. This is pretty good. I like it. So you mentioned Burkean conservative. That's where I think I'm identifying myself as now. And it reminded me of Yuval Levin's book about institutions. He said we need institutions because we need to be formed before we can be free. And then you also mentioned pluralism, and you also just mentioned philosophical responses to your survey. It reminded me of something Leo Strauss said. Leo Strauss, famous American philosopher, with respect to relativism, he said, if all cultures are equal, then cannibalism is merely an issue of culinary taste.
Yep.
And I may have got that sentence wrong. But so
my version of that is no religious freedom for Aztecs, but exactly the same point. None of us are absolute. None of us are absolutes. There are boundaries for all of us, and that includes the people who advocate total relativism. They're absolutely sure they're advocating total relativism, and there is inherently, logically, some absolute that we all hold on to. Yeah, at the core, dig down the onion deep enough, there are core beliefs about what it means to be human that shape our life, including our public life.
And certainly we're getting that brought out to the fore over the last 5 years. So second last question. You and I, so you mentioned this, we're having a philosophical discussion and, trying to figure out how to interpret this data. And we're participating in the contemplative tradition or intellectual life, right? And I warned you that I would try to sneak this question in. to see what you think about it. George Grant, so famous Canadian philosopher from the 60s, in his book Technology and Empire, the first chapter is called In Defense of North America. And he said North Americans are, they came about at a time when science was trying to fight nature, right? You had to be able to control nature to survive. And so that fit with the scientist mindset of, don't talk to me about formal and final causes. I just want to talk about material and efficient causes because I need a way to shoot the bear before it eats my cows or my kids. So it fit with a scientific mindset. And Grant argues that in the North American context, we were animated by a Calvinist theology. And Calvinism was also very anti-Aristotelian. It had antigens towards the scholastics. They didn't want to discuss how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And they didn't want to try to explain away evil and suffering. They thought that the only third response to evil and suffering was to point to the passion of Christ. And so the purpose of faith was to spread the word, spread the gospel, win souls. Don't get involved in these intellectual discussions. Don't talk about the philosophy behind the questions that you and I are enjoying so much. And certainly I enjoy these philosophical discussions. But Grant said, well, that's the Canadian mindset, is an aversion to those because we need to be practical. Now, he was bemoaning the loss of the contemplative tradition. He said, we need this in Canada or we're never going to be able to survive as a country. But what are your thoughts on, I mean, you've spent your career in this space. Have you found yourself speaking to people that even would agree with you on the ecclesiastical stuff, but say, wait a second, Pennings, this is really scary. You're sounding like an intellectual. This is not who we are as, with our Calvinist roots. Have you had a chance to think about that?
Fascinating question, and we need another hour to fully answer it. But as someone who really enjoyed William Christian's biography of George Grant some years ago, and then found myself now living about 3 blocks from Grant's home on South Street in Dundas, and driving by it and being reminded readily, there's lots of takeoff points. I also, my parents emigrated to Canada from the Netherlands as teenagers. I'm a Dutch Calvinist. So the benefit of being a Dutch Calvinist is we're pretty blunt. And any getting too carried away with the philosophical stuff quickly gets corrected within the community in the sense that, when I always joke that when God, as we have recorded in Adam, God brought Adam to the garden, and the trees of the garden were beautiful to look at and good for food, as says in the text. And I'm saying, I have to remind Dutch Calvinists that the beauty was first in what God said, because the Dutch Calvinists were busy measuring how many quarts of apples the tree would produce, or how many 2x4s we could cut it in, and which was the better way of proceeding. So I come from a tradition in which, yes, it is, the framework is there, but it's translating it into reality. It's not just leaving things at a theoretical level. That said, there are some basics along the way. I'm a Christian. Fundamentally, I believe in hope. And why do I believe in hope? I believe in hope because I believe that Jesus Christ was a real person who lived in real life, who died, and who is alive today. Paul writes, if that's not true, then our faith is vain. So that isn't an incontestable, the reality of that question. There are lots of people who differ with me, but there are some fundamental givens that you have as a Christian in all of life. If I'm going to believe that in private life, it has its implications for public life. I can't escape it. So either I say I'm wrong when I believe that Jesus rose again, or if I truly believe it, it has implications for all of life. So there are foundational givens. We at Cardus, 25 years ago, together with Michael Van Pelt, started a think tank. We're blessed today. We have over 40 staff. I take some pride in the fact that We don't have a statement of faith. We use Apostles' Creed. Christian. When people say, what do you mean by Christian? We say the Apostles' Creed. I have Catholics. I have Greek Orthodox. I have every denomination under the sun along the way. And frankly, most of us are fairly conservative in our own traditions. But right across the board, the people who go to Baptist churches and some who are very involved in poverty reduction and care for the poor, others in different traditions. So different emphases. Makes for robust conversations around the staff room table and at the water cooler. But, we live together. We have a commonality in terms of those foundational basics. And then we ask questions about what does this mean for reintegration of prisoners into the workforce? What does it mean about forgiveness in the society? We talk about Indigenous reconciliation. Can you have Indigenous reconciliation without some concept of public forgiveness? Is forgiveness just confession and making apologies? Is it reparations? Is it ever get to the point where you're actually forgiven and you can move on? Those are deep questions, but very practical for the issues of the day. And I don't think you can escape them, because if you want to proceed that there is no such sense of forgiveness, that we are entirely in a meritorious, there's some on the other side of the spectrum who don't view every human being as image bearer of God. They basically, depending on the color of your skin or your gender or that, you're either an oppressor or an oppressed. I probably, as a white middle-aged male Christian, am in the oppressor category. And, can I ever change, or am I stuck to that? If I'm stuck to that for the rest of my life, that has implications for how I'm going to behave. And, you're saying you stuck to that, you need to make reparations and everything else, and what? I need to die doing that and not, well, there are existential issues, and I don't think you can explain the rise of the religious right and the populist right and especially young men today and everything that's happening there. I don't think you can explain that without looking at some of these things that they're being told by society. And I would say, as a Christian, I have a very different message. I have a message that, yes, suffering and evil are real. They are there. We're not going to escape them. It is, a life beyond now before they'll be fully dealt with. But they will be fully dealt with, and that reality can actually shape us with hope as we live in the public square today. We can have an imagination for a flourishing society. That picture is there. That's possible. And it's a better way to live together.
Yeah. So many jumping off points there, but I promised I would only ask you one more question. And I usually end by saying, what have I completely missed? So we've been talking for an hour, and is there something that you're saying, gosh, I just wish he would have asked me X, Y, or Z, or people really need to be focusing on this. So what have I missed?
I don't think we missed anything. Let me just, in summary, try to pull, we've gone lots of different places. Let me pull things together back to the data, because I think, when I saw the data, I was not surprised at religiosity being double in the U.S. than it was in Canada. We've known that from multiple studies, and this study confirms what was already known. I think what this study tells us that we did not know before was, with much more nuance, the fact that in the States, much of the political phenomena is very positive of the country, the government, and where they are going, and they're seeing a religious expression and affirmation through the public square. In Canada, we are seeing the recognition that, number one, there's much less of a homogeneous religiously committed population. Secondly, what is interesting is that Canadian religiously committed people donate more, volunteer more, care for their neighbors, actually have more conversations with people they disagree with than not only their neighbors south of the border, but then Canadians generally. The vast majority of the charitable giving and all the rest in Canada, not just to religious causes, but the most likely coach of your kid's team is someone who is religiously committed. When you actually, and hugely disproportionate number, they're very small, depending on how you measure, 16% in terms of the 6 or 7, if we want to use the second category. About 1/3 of Canadians are on the religious side where they do some religious practice. 2/3 are in their day-to-day life practically non-religious, even if they check the box. That 1/3 of Canadians gives us the very significant proportion of the charitable giving, of the volunteering, of the serving on boards, industry associations, they are performing a very significant role in what makes Canada Canada today. And I think the fact that they are feeling that they can't be public about it, I think the fact that they are feeling that the culture is hostile to them, is an area of concern, and if left unaddressed has repercussions. And I think that's a significant issue. Canadian leaders, thought leaders, not just the contemplative ones, but the real practical ones who want votes and want dollars and want employees and want all the other stuff, that we need to be thinking and talking about.
Yeah, powerful message. Ray Pennings, co-founder and executive VP of the think tank Cardus. Be sure to check it out. We'll have links in the show notes. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure.
Mine too.